I hear whispers of treason.
We must be careful.
Someone fell. Her neck snapped, and her life ended at the bottom of a cold stone stairwell. But what truly shook the kingdom wasn't the broken body on the floor, it was the heart that broke in silence above it. On the 8th day of September, in the year 1560, Amy Robsart died. The wife of Lord Robert Dudley was found at the foot of the stairs. Some said she fell. Most believed she was pushed, but almost no one thought it was an accident. Within hours, the rumors began. Did Dudley murder his wife to clear the way to marry Queen Elizabeth? The gossip spread like wildfire. And with it, any hope Elizabeth had for personal happiness was burned to ash. She had loved him, her sweet Robin, since they were young. They had suffered the Tower of London together. He was her constant, her anchor. But now he was poison. The young queen, barely 27 years old, could not afford to begin her reign by wedding a man suspected of murder. Her mother's ghost, Anne Boleyn, executed for adultery, still haunted the throne. Elizabeth chose strategy over emotion, her crown over her heart. But what if Amy hadn't died suspiciously? What if she died slowly? From illness, with doctors confirming every step. What if there had been no scandal? No murder whispers. No shame. What if the biggest obstacle to love had been cleared by fate itself? Then the story flips. In the spring of 1561, Elizabeth announces her intent to marry, not for alliance, not for gain, but for love. She tells her council she will take Robert Dudley as her husband to produce an heir. The room explodes. William Cecil is horrified. The Duke of Norfolk feels his power slipping. The great family's Howards. Boleyns bristle at the idea of a common nobleman rising above them all. But Elizabeth is a Tudor, and when a Tudor makes a decision, nothing stands in her way. The wedding happens. Glorious, golden, and cursed from the start. Because the court splits immediately. There are the Queen's men, loyal to Dudley. And then there are the old lions, Cecil, Norfolk, and their ilk plot in silence, waiting. But then something impossible happens. In the year 1563, Elizabeth gives birth, not to a girl easily sidelined, but to a boy, a strong, healthy boy. They name him Henry. And the bells of London ring louder than they have in a generation. The endless crisis of succession, the knife-edge balancing act of the last century, is suddenly resolved in a single cry from a newborn. With that birth, everything changes. The marriage is sealed with divine approval. The people rejoice, but so do England's enemies in anger. France and Spain see the boy not as a baby, but as a bomb. England now has a Protestant heir, a Protestant dynasty. The Virgin Queen has become a wife and a mother, and her kingdom, once open to alliance, has closed its doors. Mary, Queen of Scots, still lives. But now she is more than a threat. She is a weapon, a symbol. And the north of England begins to boil. The court becomes a war zone. Shakespeare, in this world, never writes for a mysterious queen alone. Instead, he writes for a royal family. The virgin cult vanishes. Politics turn from performance to legacy. The Armada still comes, but this time, at Tilbury. It is not a lone queen standing tall. It is a mother, a father, and the future King of England. Elizabeth dies near the end of the 1590s. There is no power vacuum, no struggle. Her son takes the crown without question. He becomes Henry IX. And Robert Dudley, the boy who once sat beside her in the Tower, lives to see his son wear the crown. They had married, they had ruled, and together, they changed everything. They said the marriage would destroy her, that it would end her reign before it had even truly begun, that a queen in love was a queen exposed. And yet on that spring evening of the year, 1561, beneath a canopy of golden cloth stretched wide over the gardens of Whitehall, Elizabeth Tudor took Robert Dudley's hand, not in secrecy, not in shame, but in full view of the court that had long whispered of them in corridors and behind gloved hands. The music played, the nobles bowed, and the common folk, those permitted near the palace gates, cheered until their voices cracked. But inside the great hall, beneath the flickering light of 1,000 candles and the cool glint of polished silver, the mood was far from jubilant. There were smiles, yes, and gifts sent in ostentatious display. But behind every ornate mask was a pair of calculating eyes, watching, measuring, and quietly preparing for what would come next. Elizabeth had done what her counsel begged her not to. She had chosen love, and by doing so, she had turned her back on the delicate web of diplomacy that had held England steady since her accession. She had cast aside the Habsburg suitors, the Valois princes, the northern kings of cold and steel. She had walked past every glittering alliance and stepped directly into the arms of a man whose family name still reeked of treason, whose father had tried to place a teenage girl on the throne in place of Mary Tudor, and who now stood, unrepentant, beside the Queen as her equal. No one said it aloud. Not yet. But all across the realm, from the deepest drawing rooms of Norfolk to the merchant guilds of London, there were mutterings. A subject had risen above his station. The Queen had married beneath her, and though no blood had yet been spilled, the scent of unrest hung like mist in the air. The wedding night itself passed in near silence. There was no public betting, no bawdy chorus of nobles dragging the couple to their chamber, as tradition often demanded. Elizabeth, ever aware of the power of performance, allowed no such spectacle. She did not wish to share that moment with her court, with her enemies, with history. The heavy doors closed. The guards turned away. And for the first time in her life, Elizabeth Tudor stood alone in a room without obligation. No letters to draft, no treaties to ponder, no speeches to memorize. Only the man she had known since they were children. The boy who had clutched her hand when the tower gates had shut behind them. The friend who had survived every rumor, every storm, every distance. Her Robin. And now, her husband. But the sun does not pause for sentiment. And by dawn, the kingdom expected answers. William Cecil arrived before breakfast had even been laid. His face, normally pale, was near bloodless now, and the dark crescents beneath his eyes seemed carved by fury. He did not kneel. He did not bow. He demanded audience. Elizabeth, seated beside her new husband, listened in silence as Cecil paced the chamber like a lion denied its prey. He spoke of betrayal, not hers, but his own sense of being cast aside. He reminded her of the risks they had taken together, the battles fought with words and parchment, not swords, to protect the realm. And she, in marrying Dudley, had tossed that all into the fire. A subject, he said again, louder this time, a mere nobleman, not a king, not a prince, and certainly not worthy of being called consort. Robert did not rise. He did not shout. Instead, he stood slowly, walked to the window, and looked out over the Thames where the ships moved like silent ghosts across the water. he said nothing at all. It was Elizabeth who spoke, her voice calm but unshakable. She reminded Cecil that she was queen not by marriage, not by favor, but by right, that her crown had been won through blood, and she would not have it questioned now, by the very man she had trusted most. She reminded him, too, that the marriage had been made not for whim, but for purpose. She intended to produce an heir. She would give England what no queen had yet given it, a future beyond her own life. Cecil bowed then, stiffly, but his silence carried more weight than any protest. He was not the only one watching. Across the realm, the old nobility began to calculate. If Dudley had the Queen's ear and her bed, then their own influence was endangered. Grants of land, titles of favor, seats at court, these could now flow toward the Dudley clan, whose ambitions had been caged for too long. Whispers began to rise, soft at first, like wind brushing silk, but growing. There were murmurs of tyranny, of a queen blinded by lust, of a country ruled not by law, but by a love affair. In the north, where loyalty to Mary, Queen of Scots, still lingered like embers in dry grass, men began to gather in private halls, counting swords, measuring grain, speaking of God and bloodlines and the rightful order of things. Yet inside the palace, life moved forward with eerie normalcy. Dudley, now titled Prince Consort, took up new duties with measured grace. He oversaw naval reforms, funded artists and scholars, and walked beside Elizabeth in state ceremonies, not as a silent ornament but as a partner. They did not pretend the court was united. They did not pretend the world was not watching. But within the walls of the Queen's private chambers, a new kind of governance was quietly blooming, one built not solely on cunning, but on shared memory and mutual trust. And then came the rumors of a child. By the end of that same year, Elizabeth was seen less often in public. Her waist thickened, her cheeks flushed easily. Physicians came and went behind drawn curtains. Cecil, though still outwardly cold, returned to her side, bringing papers, maps, reports of tension in the Low Countries and Catholic agents in Ireland. But behind every briefing lay a quiet, unspoken hope that the Queen's gamble might pay off. In the one coin, no counselor could deny a healthy heir. It was in the spring of the year 1562, when the court heard it confirmed. The Queen was with child. The announcement did not come through proclamation or trumpet, but through the quiet shifting of protocol. A new bed was ordered. Midwives were summoned. Certain foreign ambassadors were informed discreetly, and once more, the realm shifted. Not with fury, not with revolt, at least not yet, but with a breathless, waiting silence. If the child were born strong, if it were a boy, then all objections might vanish. Then even her fiercest critics might be forced to kneel. Then Elizabeth's choice would no longer seem a folly, but a masterstroke. But not all prayed for her success. Far from London, in the shadows of cathedrals where incense still clung to ancient stone, letters were penned in secret. The Pope watched with growing unease. France and Spain, denied a marriage alliance, now watched with eyes sharpened by prophecy and fear. A Protestant heir would not just secure the English Reformation, it would declare war on every Catholic crown still clinging to the old faith. The court did not sleep easily that spring, and neither did Elizabeth. Not from fear, not from regret, but from the weight of everything now bound to her body, the crown, the marriage, the future. She would carry them all. The spring of the year 1563 began like any other in the old city of London, with the Thames sluggish under a grey sky and the bells of St. Paul's echoing faintly through the morning fog. But something unspoken stirred beneath the stones, beneath the breath of the wind and the murmur of merchants. For weeks, the city had lived in anticipation, in a kind of sacred pause. The Queen was in confinement, Elizabeth Tudor, sovereign of England. The flame-haired daughter of Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII, was about to give birth. The same Elizabeth who once declared she would never marry, who had told Parliament that she was already married to her people, and yet here she was, inside the royal apartments at Whitehall, behind heavy drapes and guarded doors, carrying the air of Robert Dudley, the man no one had dared imagine might become a king. Even in Name, the court had grown strangely quiet, the usual cacophony of petitions, flattery, and scheming was still present. Of course, but it moved like a procession through thick wool. Even the most vicious of Elizabeth's enemies, even those who despised the upstart Dudley clan and longed for the old noble houses to retake their primacy, had been stilled by the sheer weight of possibility. For if the child was born healthy, if it was a boy, then all the arguments would die in the cradle. The marriage that had once seemed so ruinous would be justified by nature itself. The realm would have its future. The century-long specter of childless succession, of civil war, of factions and foreign claims, banished in a single cry, and that cry came just before sunrise. On the 5th day of April, in the year 1563, the Queen's physicians, who had waited like statues for hours outside the birthing chamber, suddenly heard it a wail so sharp and sudden that it cut through the corridors like a blade. Then silence. Then the voice of a midwife calling for linen, and another for clean water. And then footsteps, rushing, whispering, laughing, weeping. Robert Dudley, standing as he had done for nearly 30 hours in the chamber next door, pressed a hand to the wood of the door as if to steady himself. He did not ask. He could not. He simply waited. At last, the chamberlain emerged, eyes wide and voice hoarse with disbelief and reverence. "A prince," he said. "A prince. My lord. A strong, living prince." And London erupted. Before the hour was out, the bells began to ring, not for war, not for coronation, not for mourning, but for birth, for life. From St. Olebling, Paul's to Southwark, from Westminster to the far eastern reaches of the Docklands. Bells clanged like thunder rolling across rooftops. People poured into the streets. Bakers flung open their doors. Children were hoisted onto shoulders. Prayers were sung in taverns, for the first time in years. Protestant and Catholic alike knelt in the same pews, not in unity of belief, but in sheer relief that the kingdom might now be spared the horrors of an uncertain future. They named him Henry, not for his father, but for his grandfather, the king whose shadow still loomed large across the aisle, who had split the church from Rome and birthed a dynasty that had nearly died out in blood and silence. This new Henry was not the product of violence or political expedience. He was the child of a queen who had loved, who had defied her counsel, who had bet her throne on the possibility that happiness and strength might coexist. And now that gamble had paid off, the christening was held 2 weeks later in Westminster Abbey. And it was a vision not of solemnity, but of spectacle. The infant was swaddled in gold thread, lifted above a crowd of nobles who could scarcely believe what they were witnessing. Robert Dudley stood at Elizabeth's side, no longer the court favorite, no longer the whispered paramour, but the father of the heir, the man who had carved his place into the very fabric of England's destiny, and yet, beneath the velvet and silver and lilies, the court's divisions did not vanish. They only shifted, deeper and more dangerous. For now, a new power had risen, not just the queen and her consort, but the prince. Every decision made from that day forward would be viewed through the lens of succession. Every ally would position themselves near the boy. Every enemy would seek to control him, or failing that, to remove him. Elizabeth knew this. She had lived long enough in the snake pit of politics to sense the movement of venom, even when it crawled in silence. She did not allow her son to be raised by any single household. She did not trust the Dudleys. Not entirely. Nor the Cecils. Nor the Howards. Instead, she crafted something new, a rotation of guardians. Carefully chosen. Never allowed too close. Never allowed too long. She remained, always, at the center of the boy's life. And so did his father, Robert Dudley, now styled Duke of Kenilworth and Prince Consort of England, grew into the role with an intensity that surprised even his detractors. He had always been a man of ambition and charm. But now, he was something else: responsible, focused, fiercely devoted to his son and wife. He pushed for reforms in the Navy. He increased patronage of Protestant scholars and printing houses. And most importantly, he began to train young Henry not as a puppet, not as a symbol, but as a future king. The boy was quick. He had his mother's eyes and his father's energy. By the time he was 5 years old, he could read Latin aloud. By 7, he rode with poise. By 9, he was writing letters in his own hand to the governors of Calais and the Protestant provinces in the Low Countries. He was, in the eyes of the realm, nothing less than miraculous. But with the miracle came enemies, France and Spain. Once circling Elizabeth with marriage proposals and emissaries wrapped in silk and scripture, now regarded England with cold hostility. The birth of Henry had sealed the door. There would be no alliance through blood, no marriageable queen to barter. England had planted its flag firmly in the Protestant soil, and worse still, it had passed that flame to the next generation. Pope Pius, in Rome, wept publicly for the English soul. His tears, though pious, were not idle. Letters were dispatched. Envoys met in secret. Jesuit agents were smuggled into the country. In the north, the Catholic earls began to gather again. Their hopes for Mary, Queen of Scots, dimmed but not extinguished. If they could not rule through Elizabeth, they would bide their time. They would wait for her death. They would hope for Henry's soul to be twisted toward Rome, or failing that, they would tear it from him. Elizabeth responded as only she could, with precision and silence. She did not tighten her grip openly. She did not banish her Catholic nobles or burn them on sight. Instead, she began to build a network, quiet and deep, gift of men loyal, not just to her but to Henry. A second crown, still a child, still distant, but rising. And as the years passed, the memory of the wedding scandal began to soften. Not in truth, but in tone. The marriage no longer seemed dangerous. It seemed fated. Poets began to speak of it as a great gamble that paid divine dividends. Painters began to depict the royal family, not as broken from tradition, but as the saviors of the realm's future. Elizabeth, once scorned as too proud, now seemed wise beyond reckoning. Robert, once derided as grasping, was now spoken of as a father before all things. In the year 1570, young Prince Henry was presented before Parliament for the first time. He stood beside his mother, dressed in robes a shade too heavy for his slight frame, and read aloud a brief statement pledging his service to England. The applause was thunderous. Even those who had once sworn to oppose the Dudley name found themselves unable to look away. It was not just that the realm had been given an heir. It was that the heir, for once, had seemed worthy of it. It was one thing for England to crown a queen. It was another entirely to see her bear a son. But for the Catholic powers of Europe, the true threat emerged, not in the soft cradle of the prince, nor in the quiet strength of Elizabeth's rule. It came with time. When the promises they had once whispered in ballrooms and chapels were answered not with marriage but with silence. For nearly a decade, they had waited, watching, hoping the Virgin Queen would be wise enough or vulnerable enough to join her throne with one of theirs. A Spanish Habsburg, a French Valois, even a Scandinavian match had once seemed possible. But now all such plans lay in ashes, swept away by the cry of a Tudor Dudley child whose very existence shut the door to foreign alliance. And behind that closed door, a new kind of England began to take shape. The court still glittered. Ambassadors still arrived. But where once they had come bearing portraits of princely sons and chests of jeweled promises, now they came with veiled threats, searching questions, and a growing unease. The Queen remained civil, unfailingly so. But her gaze was no longer that of a bride. To be it was the gaze of a monarch with nothing to trade but strength. Her marriage to Dudley had redefined England's posture in the eyes of the world. What had once been a potential bride state had become a locked house. Self-sufficient, proud, dangerous. In Madrid, King Philip's disappointment turned swiftly to resentment. The very woman he had once considered courting after the death of her sister Mary had now birthed a Protestant dynasty, an English lineage that would rival his own in longevity and ambition. And worse, it was not a quiet Protestantism. Robert Dudley, now elevated in title and influence, pushed his queen to lean further into the religious cause. He urged her not just to defend the faith but to export it. And though Elizabeth's cautious instincts reigned in the wildest of his schemes, his voice grew louder with every passing year. By the mid-1560s, English ships began docking in La Rochelle, not to trade but to deliver supplies, arms, gunpowder, coin to the Protestant Huguenots, rebelling against the French crown. At first it was done quietly, under cover of private initiative, but soon the involvement was undeniable. Elizabeth did not deny it. She justified it. If France sought to suppress men for their faith, she said, then England would not stand idly by. The memory of her father's break with Rome, the memory of her mother's execution by a Catholic queen, still pulsed beneath her skin. The Queen had chosen her side, and now she would act like it. The Pope issued a warning, then a bull, then silence. For in Rome, the realization had taken hold. England was not drifting toward heresy. It had planted a Protestant flag into the earth, and now guarded it with fire. The Spanish were the first to test that flame. In the year 1567, the word reached Whitehall that Spain was amassing troops in the Netherlands, not simply to restore order, but to crush the growing rebellion of Dutch Protestants who now received aid, encouragement, and intelligence from English agents. The Duke of Alva, grim and implacable, marched into the Low Countries with steel in his eyes and Catholic banners in his wake. Elizabeth responded with letters at first, carefully worded statements of concern, but Dudley was not satisfied. Eadagwith, again and again. That silence was complicity. That hesitation was death. that if England did not defend its fellow believers now, it would face them alone later. He pushed for open war. He called for troops to be sent across the sea, not as smugglers or saboteurs, but as soldiers under the banner of England's crown. Elizabeth hesitated. She had always known how to play the long game. Her strength had been patience, ambiguity, the art of saying little and gaining much. But now she had a husband, a son, a legacy to guard. The fires of conviction, once kept deep within her, began to glow nearer the surface. She authorized more than letters. She authorized arms, funding, even advisors to the Dutch rebel leaders. And when news came that Catholic agents had been caught plotting against her life in York, agents funded, it was said, by Spain, she no longer acted as a diplomat. She acted as a sovereign at war. Thus began the Cold War of religion. It was not declared, not openly. Treaties were not torn. Flags were not raised. But the waters of the Channel began to teem with English ships flying false colors, their holds filled with munitions. Spanish galleons responded in kind, patrolling the edges of English trade routes, boarding vessels, interrogating crews. The skirmishes were scattered and deniable, but they multiplied. French agents were caught in Kent. English agents disappeared in Flanders. And always, the boy at the center of it all grew older, stronger, more visible. Henry, now styled Prince of Wales, was no longer a name on a baptismal certificate. He was a boy of 10, then 11, then 12. He trained with swords. He debated with bishops. He began to ride with his father through the countryside, stopping to speak with nobles and villagers alike. His face became familiar, his future inevitable. And in every foreign court from Vienna to Rome to Lisbon, his name was spoken with a new kind of apprehension. He was the child not of compromise, but of decision, not of peace, but of permanence. And abroad, the pressure grew. France sent veiled threats. Spain sent darker ones. Even Scotland, fractured and restless, began to feel the stirrings of something ancient resentment, perhaps, or vengeance. For Mary, Queen of Scots, though still held under house arrest at Elizabeth's command, remained a beacon for every Catholic nobleman who dreamed of a different England. Her claim had dimmed, but had not died. And now, with the religious climate shifting toward open hostility, her name returned to the mouths of plotters like a ghost in the dark. Elizabeth tightened her security. The Privy Council expanded its intelligence network. But even within the walls of the court, there were cracks. Some of the older nobles still chafed under Dudley's rise. They remembered his father's treason. They saw in his son the makings of a dynasty that would erase their own bloodlines. They whispered not of murder, not yet, but of alternatives. Of what might happen if Henry were to die, if the Queen were to fall ill, if Mary were to escape. Elizabeth heard all of it. She did not rage. She did not lash out. But she did what she had always done best. She planned. She began to slowly redraw her court, replacing the wavering with the loyal, the cautious with the committed. She expanded the powers of the royal guard. She ensured that Henry would be surrounded by teachers, mentors, and soldiers who owed their status, not to ancient name, but to royal favor. She made Dudley responsible for the boy's safety, not because she feared her husband, but because she trusted him more than any other soul alive. And yet even trust was not enough to soothe her fears when the ships were sighted off the coast of Cornwall. It was the summer of the year 1574 when Elizabeth received word that a fleet of Spanish vessels, larger than trade required, but smaller than war might explain, had been seen moving north from the Bay of Biscay. Dudley suspected a test, a probing mission, a warning, perhaps even a masked invasion. Elizabeth, her fingers tightening around the arm of her chair, called a council at midnight. Torches flickered against the high stone walls. Maps were unrolled. Commander summoned. The fleet did not land, but it circled, observed, measured, and then it turned south again. No cannon was fired. No soldier stepped ashore. But the message had been sent. England was being watched, and the boy who would one day wear the crown was no longer a symbol. He was a threat. From that night on, Elizabeth no longer treated the conflict as theoretical. She began to prepare the nation not for war. Not yet, but for siege. Fortifications were examined. Supply chains reviewed. The Navy, under Dudley's continued leadership, expanded with a vigor not seen since the reign of her father. And in secret, the Queen began to draft something else, a document not yet ready for ink or seal, but growing in her mind day by day. It was a will, for she had come to understand what many of her subjects had long feared, that her son, her Henry, was no longer just the future of England. He was its most precious, most vulnerable target. And so she began to imagine a world without her. The winter of the year, 1569, began like a whisper and ended in blood. At first, it was only smoke messages that moved too quickly through Yorkshire. Too many noblemen gathering under too many excuses. Hunts that lasted longer than they should. Feasts where toasts went unrecorded. Letters sent to Scotland with no reply. Then sent again. This time by courier instead of rider. Elizabeth, ever the student of patterns, saw it coming before most in her council did, but even her sharpest intuition could not guess just how wide the fire would spread or how personal the flames would burn. For this was not a rebellion of poverty. It was not a peasant's riot over grain or tax. It was not the angry lashing of the desperate. It was something far colder, something calculated. This was a rebellion of nobility, of men with names older than the Tudors themselves. Men who believed England had been hijacked by love, that the Queen had let lust make a king of a subject, and that the child born from that union was not a blessing, but a usurper in gold thread. They called it loyalty. They claimed to rise for God, for order, for tradition. But behind every prayer whispered in candlelight, behind every crucifix raised in trembling hands, there beat a simple, seething truth. They could not stand to kneel to a Dudley. The North had always been England's wound, too close to Scotland, too far from court, and filled with memories of old faith and old thrones. The Catholics there had never fully accepted the Reformation. They had suffered it, endured it, but never embraced it. And in Mary, Queen of Scots, they saw not just a woman with a claim to England's throne, they saw a martyr waiting to be crowned. Even in captivity, Mary was dangerous. She had lost a husband, lost a crown, lost a child to another's care. But her eyes, when she looked southward, still gleamed with fire. Her beauty had dimmed little, and her charm, not at all. She wrote carefully, with words that could be read one way by her jailers and another by her allies. And in those dark northern halls, where families still kept relics of the old church in secret, her name passed from lip to lip with reverence. They began to gather under the old banners, the Earls of Northumberland and Westmoreland, once trusted, now hardened by years of seeing Protestants rise while they were pushed aside. They claimed they rose to free Mary, to restore the Catholic faith. and to remove the evil influence of Robert Dudley from the Queen. But even that was a mask. Their true aim was clear: to strike at the royal family itself. The plan was brutal in its precision. Elizabeth would be assassinated. Dudley would be torn from power. The young Prince Henry, barely 6 years old, would be taken and raised as a Catholic, a puppet on their string. Mary would rule as regent until the boy came of age. And thus would begin a new dynasty, one born not of sin and scandal, but of righteous correction. But they miscalculated. They thought the Queen soft in her love, distracted by motherhood, weakened by sentiment. They forgot she was her father's daughter. The rising began in November. Under the howling skies of Durham, the rebels seized churches, tore out English Bibles, restored the Latin Mass. Monasteries long closed were relit by candlelight. From every village they passed, they gathered more men, more swords, more prayers. And yet, from the very beginning, it was too late. Elizabeth had already moved. Her spies had warned her weeks before. Her guard had doubled. Her son had been relocated to Windsor, protected by a rotating watch of men who answered to no one but the Queen herself. Dudley, furious and focused, was granted full military command of the southern defense. And the council, once bitterly divided between Cecil and Dudley, united in a way it never had before. The Queen was no longer just a sovereign. She was a mother under siege. She addressed the nation not from behind glass, but from horseback, dressed in armor, her face pale but resolute. She rode before the mustered troops at York, her voice rising like a blade. She spoke not of politics, but of betrayal, not of Protestantism, but of survival. Her child, she said, would not be taken. Her people, she vowed, would not kneel to any sword but her own. And when she finished, there were tears in the eyes of men who had once cursed her marriage. The response was swift. More than 10,000 loyal troops marched north under the command of Lord Clinton and Dudley's younger brother, Ambrose. The rebels, though fierce and fired by faith, were fractured by vanity. Some argued to wait for Spanish aid that would never come. Others rushed too far, too fast, hoping to seize Mary before the Queen could move her. But Elizabeth had already acted. Mary was whisked away in the dead of night to a more secure fortress, far from the rebel roots. She would not be used as a banner for treason. The clash came at Carlisle. It was no grand battle of cavalry and banners. It was a slaughter. The rebels, disorganized and desperate, were routed within hours. Many tried to flee back to their estates, to bury their armor and beg forgiveness. But Elizabeth did not forgive. She ordered executions, not symbolic, not restrained. Hundreds were hanged along the roads from York to Durham. Their bodies, left as warnings, swung in the wind for weeks. Noblemen, who had once supped at her table, were dragged before tribunals and stripped of land, title, and in many cases, their lives. The bloodbath was methodical, and it worked. The North fell silent, not in conversion, but in fear. In London, there was unease even in victory. The scope of the rebellion, the rage it had revealed, shook the court. Elizabeth knew the threat was not extinguished. It had only been forced to smolder underground. And so she hardened her court, her home, and her heart. She appointed loyalists to the council, men not born into greatness, but elevated by her hand, men who owed everything to her and nothing to the old blood. She increased the presence of royal guards across the kingdom. She created new laws, allowing her to seize Catholic property in times of suspicion. And most importantly, she redefined treason, not just as action, but as intent. And her son, he watched, Henry, now old enough to read the reports himself, sat in silence as his tutors spoke of loyalty, of discipline, of sacrifice. He did not cry, he did not speak, but that winter changed him. He began to carry himself not just as a prince, but as a future commander. He practiced with blade and bow longer. He studied maps. He listened to council meetings, not as a boy bored by talk, but as a young man memorizing every word. He knew now that his claim to the crown was not simply inherited, it was hunted. Elizabeth, too, was changed. She no longer spoke of retiring from rule, of passing authority to her son in her later years. She resolved to remain until Henry was not only the heir by blood, but the heir by strength. She would mold him, shield him, and one day, she would place a crown on his head, not in a moment of peace, but as a message to the world. We endured, and Mary she faded, slowly, into a shadow, still watched, still whispered of, but never again a rallying cry. She would remain a prisoner until her final breath. Elizabeth would see to that personally. The blood had been spilled, the throne had been tested, and from that test, something colder was born, a kingdom less trusting, more watchful, forever aware that even the most golden heir could draw daggers from those who smiled. There are victories in history that feel like endings, battles won, rebellions crushed, oaths restored, moments where it seems that peace has been bought, that order has returned, that the crown is safe again atop the sovereign's head. But Elizabeth Tudor, by the winter following the rising of the North, knew better. She knew that silence did not mean unity, that obedience was not always loyalty, that the blood on the stones of York had not sealed her legacy. It had simply drawn a line deeper in the sand, because love, as it turned out, was expensive. Her marriage to Robert Dudley had given her what no monarch in her line had dared to hope for: a son. An heir. A continuation of Tudor breath. It had secured the succession, answered the prayers of generations, and for a time had lit a golden fire through the streets of London. But it had also cleaved her kingdom in two. The division was not neatly drawn between Protestant and Catholic. That would have been easier. No. The wound ran across bloodlines, between cousins, between men who once toasted the same queen and now muttered different prayers under their breath. It divided the court into camps that rarely spoke, except through carefully phrased letters or glances heavy with history. On one side were the Queen's men, those who owed their status to her favor, to their faith in her marriage, and to their allegiance to the young Prince Henry. They were the Dudley circle, ambitious, newer in name, and hungrier in instinct. Many of them had served in the Queen's campaigns abroad, or in the Navy, or in the restructured local governments of the post-rebellion North. They viewed the old nobility with wary contempt. To them, England was no longer ruled by tradition, it was ruled by merit and loyalty. And loyalty meant loyalty to the royal family. All of it. Not just to Elizabeth, but to Robert and the child who would one day be king. On the other side were the loyalists, but not loyal to Elizabeth alone. These were the men who had served her father, her half-sister, even her grandfather. Men whose titles stretched back to the Plantagenets, who saw themselves not as courtiers but as guardians of the realm's proper shape. Many of them had supported the Queen at the start, even praised her careful handling of foreign policy and her early resistance to marriage. But now they saw a court that no longer spoke their language, They saw Dudley not as a prince consort, but as a usurper in velvet. They saw Henry not as a savior, but as a child with half the blood they deemed worthy. They said little aloud, but they said it often behind closed doors. Elizabeth, caught between these two worlds, did what she had always done. She performed. She did not punish the old nobility outright. She continued to grant them honors, so long as they stayed within the lines she had drawn. She attended their family funerals, their weddings, their ceremonies. But behind the curtain, she drew her son closer and gave him more to see. She had him sit beside her during audiences, had him ride at her right hand in processions. She ensured that every courtier, old or new, understood that the future would not look like the past. Robert Dudley saw the fracture, too. He tried, in his way, to soften it. He hosted banquets for the Howards, offered patronage to the descendants of the Nevilles, even arranged advantageous marriages for families whose fortunes had faltered. But his attempts, though earnest, rang hollow to those who had once watched his father attempt to seize the crown through Lady Jane Grey. They saw in him not generosity, but ambition. And when, in the year 1576, he was granted further powers over the royal council, powers that gave him authority to approve military appointments, they saw not partnership, but consolidation. The court became a house of whispers. There were no open plots. Not then. But there were letters passed quietly from one noble house to another. A few went to Paris. A few reached the papal courts. One or two may even have passed through Spanish hands. None called for assassination. None called for revolt. But all shared one chilling thought. What would happen if Henry died? And Elizabeth knew what she had always known. That was the price of what she had chosen. She had walked through fire to bring a child into the world. And now that child would live forever in danger. Not just from abroad, from popes and kings and spies, but from the very stones of England. From the very men who wore its rings and spoke its tongue. And so she made a decision. She would not rule alone anymore. That summer, she appointed her son, then barely 14, as formal Prince Regent in certain affairs of state. It was not full authority, but it was enough to mark a shift. He began to preside over minor councils, to appear in the Tower with guards of his own. He signed his first royal orders, limited though they were, with a trembling but determined hand. And the realm took notice. To some, it was a sign of maturity. To others, it was the beginning of a dangerous elevation. But none could deny that the boy was brilliant. He had his mother's command of speech, his father's charm, and a strange stillness in moments of tension that made even seasoned courtiers pause. He did not rant. He did not boast. He listened, measured, learned, and when he spoke, it was with a gravity beyond his years. In the city, prints of him began to circulate, not just in noble homes, but in taverns and merchant stalls. The boy prince with the hawk's eyes, the boy who had survived rebellion and was now stepping into light. In song and story, he began to displace the image of his mother as the solitary monarch. Now, it was the family Elizabeth, Robert, and Henry who became the face of England. But unity, once broken, never mends fully. And in the background, the discontent deepened. In the southern shires, landowners muttered about Dudley's rise. In Ireland, Catholic lords began to receive secret shipments from unknown patrons. And in France, where the wars of religion had turned Paris into a burning crucible, new alliances were drawn in fear of a fully Protestant English future. By the end of that year, The word dynasty no longer referred to the Tudors alone. It referred to the Dudleys. Elizabeth, now nearing her mid-40s, did not grow weaker, but she grew more aware of time. Her son would soon be a man. Her enemies would grow bolder as he came of age. And so, she did what no woman in her position had ever done before. She began to prepare England not just for a transition of power, but for a permanent shift in how it would see itself, not as a kingdom of rotating monarchs, but as a house, a legacy, a family, and she would keep it intact, no matter the cost. There are myths that grow not from truth, but from longing, and in the world we once knew the one where Elizabeth Tudor never married, where her eyes flashed alone in candlelight, where her court danced in a delicate ritual of poetry and performance. The greatest myth of all was that of the Virgin Queen. She was not simply sovereign, she was symbol. She became England itself, aloof, untouchable, above desire and beyond defeat. The cult of Gloriana grew around her like marble vines, carved by playwrights, painters, poets, and dreamers who dared not speak her name without awe. But in this world, this different history, this changed thread, there was no such marble. There was no myth. There was only a woman, and she had chosen to be loved. By the year 1578, Elizabeth Tudor was no longer a queen surrounded by silence. Her court, once echoing with unspoken longing, now rang with children's laughter. The clatter of sparring swords from the prince's courtyard, and the steady voice of Robert Dudley, walking the halls with papers in hand and a mind ever busy. The love that had once threatened to ruin her had now become part of the air itself. And in that air, the very soul of the English Renaissance began to shift. Because when the court changed, so too did its art. Gone was the breathless worship of a distant queen whose favor could be won with verses and violets. The men of Elizabeth's court no longer wrote sonnets to an untouchable flame. They wrote of duty, of heritage, of legacy, of power shared and tested. They wrote of royal children, of a prince coming into his own. They wrote of a woman who had aged, not faded, who had ruled, not waited. They wrote, above all, of family. William Shakespeare, in this world, was no less brilliant, but he was different. He arrived in London in the early 1590s, just as Prince Henry was being declared heir in Parliament, his name etched into the official line of succession with no voice in protest. The young bard found a court that no longer thirsted for illusion. It craved reflection. His early histories, once thought destined to echo the tensions of Richard III and the shadow of failed heirs, now turned toward the glories of strong rule. Henry V rose again, not as a warning of fragile masculinity, but as an echo of young Prince Henry's poise and promise. Plays like Julius Caesar still warned of ambition. But now they played to audiences who had seen what happened when power was shared too freely and when it was not shared at all. Shakespeare's comedies, too, shifted their mood. The playful dangers of mistaken identity and forbidden love gave way to stories that gently questioned what it meant to be noble, to be loyal, to serve a queen who was no longer an ideal, but a mother, a wife, and a sovereign all at once. And as for the tragedies, they were no longer built around the unattainable woman. There was no Ophelia cast aside by a Hamlet mirroring a nation's indecision. There was no Lady Macbeth whose thirst for power echoed the silent fears of a barren queen. Instead, his heroines were grounded, intelligent, flawed, queens who made mistakes, mothers who lost children, wives who held kingdoms in the quiet of their gaze. The court became not just a place of politics, but of storytelling. Elizabeth and Robert hosted evenings of theater in the open air, where Henry would sit cross-legged at his mother's feet, his tutors behind him, and listen not with the awe of a subject, but with the hunger of a future ruler, watching his people learn how to see themselves. Painters began to change their brush strokes. The great portraits of the era did not show Elizabeth floating in eternal youth, decked in pearl and stiff ruff like a goddess. Instead, they captured her later years with a human light in her eyes, the soft lines of age across her brow, her fingers clasped, not on a globe or a book, but on the arm of her husband, or the shoulder of her son, where once she had been painted alone. Now the canvas widened. The Dudley family appeared together, three figures in gold and black, standing not as icons, but as a unit. It changed how women saw themselves. It changed how England saw its queens. No longer was femininity and power associated with sacrifice. Elizabeth had not given up love to reign. She had simply demanded that her love become part of her rule. And though many women still could not vote, still could not own land freely, still moved through life at the mercy of their fathers and husbands, they now had a sovereign who had rewritten the equation. A woman who had become legend not by denying her heart but by following it. And yet even legends built from love are not immune to strain. By 1581, Elizabeth had ruled for more than 2 decades with Robert by her side. Their partnership had weathered rebellions, papal excommunication, foreign conspiracies, and the slow erosion of the old noble power. But time, always the silent hunter, had begun to show its hand. Robert's hair grayed at the temples. Elizabeth's hands trembled slightly when signing royal orders, and Henry, now a tall, broad-shouldered youth, nearing 20, had begun to assert himself in ways that brought discomfort to both. He had opinions. He had strategies. He had charm, too much of it. Some whispered. And like all sons born of giants, he had begun to stretch against the walls they had built for him. At court, younger nobles began to gather around the prince. They toasted him, shadowed him, shaped their hair and style to match his. Some were ambitious. Some were genuine. All were waiting for what no one could say aloud. Elizabeth watched it unfold with the tight, proud smile of a mother who understands both her success and the cost it carries. And Robert, he began to fade gently, stepping back from the councils more often, riding less frequently, spending longer hours at Kenilworth when he could play. His health had begun to falter, though he told no one, not even her. The Queen felt it anyway. In their quietest hours, those dusky twilight walks along the Thames, those rare nights, without the rustle of paper and state, they spoke not of power, not of plans, but of days past. The Tower, the laughter of their early courtship, the first moment she had told him she was with child, the way he had wept that morning, the way she had not, and sometimes, in those moments, and she allowed herself to imagine the other world, the one we know, the one where she had stood alone in a black dress for 40 years. Untouchable, unknowable, immortalized in a myth that had choked her name in marble. That world had its own kind of magic, its own kind of loneliness, but she had chosen this one, and now, as the bards recited sonnets about her grace, not with trembling voices, but with admiration for the life she had built, she understood that her legend would be different, not less, not dimmer, but warmer, deeper, and perhaps, just perhaps more lasting. Because in this world, England would not remember her only as the Virgin Queen. It would remember her as a woman who had ruled wisely and been loved completely. Some monarchs ruled alone because they must, others ruled alone because they chose to. Elizabeth Tudor had once stood firmly in both camps, daughter of a disgraced queen and a dangerous king. Orphaned in name, if not in body. Shaped by betrayal and by the quiet corridors of fear. She had learned young that power shared was power diluted. She had mastered the art of speaking in half answers, of appearing open, while never being truly known. She had studied the game of kingship as if her life depended on it because it did. And then, against every counsel, every warning, every shred of political logic, she had taken Robert Dudley into her arms, her bed, her counsel, her crown. It had been love. Yes, but not merely love. It had been defiance. It had been clarity. It had been a queen looking at the chessboard and choosing not to play like the men before her, but to redraw the board entirely. By the year 1584, Elizabeth and Robert had ruled together for more than 2 decades. 2 decades of storms and silence, of invasions and births, of assassinations plotted and rebellions crushed. And through it all, they had remained side by side. Rarely in perfect agreement, but always in orbit. She was the tactician, the diplomat, the mind that saw years ahead. He was the sword, the reformer, the fire that pressed forward while she held the reins. It was not a marriage without hardship. They argued. Oh, how they argued. They clashed over foreign aid to Protestant rebels, over how tightly to control their son's exposure to court politics, over the balance between mercy and might. There were nights she would walk the gardens in silence, the wind tugging her cloak, her mind a storm of doubt. There were days he would ride out to Kenilworth in grim quiet, his presence in London too sharp for the moment. And yet always they returned to each other, because theirs was not the love of sonnets anymore. It was the love of shared rule, of knowing each other's weaknesses and choosing to defend them, of watching the same problem from opposite angles and trusting that the truth lay somewhere between, of understanding that the business of a crown was rarely romantic, but that romance, in its most enduring form, could be found in loyalty that lasted through politics, through power, through time. And still, the world turned beneath them. France burned, Spain prepared, and Scotland watched. In the spring of 1585, Elizabeth received word from her spies that Philip of Spain, humiliated by decades of diplomatic failure, was assembling a fleet in Cadiz unlike anything the world had yet seen. More than 100 ships, thousands of soldiers, dozens of priests sent to bless their journey. Their target was clear: England. This would not be another subtle maneuver. This would be war. But this time, the narrative was different. England was no longer ruled by a heretic woman alone. It was ruled by a family, a queen, a prince consort, and a grown heir, Prince Henry, now nearly 22 years old, already a commander in the royal guard, already beloved by the people, not for who he might become, but for who he already was. When the ships were sighted, England did not flinch. Robert Dudley, though no longer young, resumed his post at the head of the defensive fleet, sailing to meet the Spanish Armada with a face carved in determination. Elizabeth remained in London, not hidden in a chamber, but atop a horse, riding out to Tilbury in full armor, flanked not by courtiers in ribbons, but by soldiers in steel. And beside her, riding slightly behind, was Henry, his sword drawn, his voice calm as he saluted the men who would die if they failed. The Queen gave her speech. It was not the one we remember. not the lone declaration of a woman with the heart and stomach of a king. In this world, her words were shared, spoken first by her, then echoed by her son, and then by her husband. 3 voices, 1 vow, that England would not bow, that England would not break, that their blood, Tudor and Dudley alike, would stand in the breach if the ships broke the shore. But the ships never did. The armada scattered. Storms tore at their sails. English fireships harried them like wolves in the night. Dudley, aboard the Lionheart, led the final charge that drove the Spanish fleet from the Channel. He was injured in the process, his shoulder shattered by falling debris, but he returned to shore upright. His coat torn, his face grim, and his name now etched into the hearts of a people who had once doubted him. The victory was complete, and yet, in the months that followed, it was not triumph that defined Elizabeth's court. It was reckoning. Robert's wound did not heal easily. He withdrew from public life. For the first time, not in strategy, but in necessity, Elizabeth visited him often, sometimes daily. She no longer wore the pearls and diamonds of state when she sat beside his bed. She wore linen, her hands, once soft and pale, grew calloused from the work of writing letters by his side, feeding him broth in quiet hours, pressing his fingers when the pain came. She loved him still, not with the fire of youth, but with the steadiness of a soul shaped by years beside his. And Henry, for the first time, he began to move fully into the role his birth had destined. He took on the management of foreign envoys. He spoke in Parliament with confidence. His speeches were noted for their clarity, their resolve, and most tellingly, their mercy. He pardoned former enemies. He reached out to Catholic nobles, not with bribes, but with honesty. The future will not erase the past, he said once, standing before a silent hall, but it must outlive it. Elizabeth watched her son step forward, and she felt time shift again. By the autumn of 1586, Robert Dudley's health had worsened. He could still speak, still smile, but his body had begun its long, a slow departure. The court knew it. The people knew it. But it was not treated as a tragedy. It was treated as a passage. For what he had built, what they had built, was no longer fragile. It was a house, a dynasty, a nation shaped not just by one monarch, but by a pair. 2 lives wound so tightly together that even in leaving, one did not fully disappear. That winter, as snow began to fall gently upon the banks of the Thames, Elizabeth took her husband's hand one night, when all others had left the room. His breath was shallow. His eyes, though dimmed, still sought hers. She whispered something none ever recorded. What? And when his hand finally stilled, she did not cry. She only closed his fingers around hers, and sat there in silence. A queen, a widow, a legend still in motion. The winter after Robert Dudley's death was quiet, not the silence of grief alone, but the silence of a world pausing, as if holding its breath in reverence. The court at Whitehall moved softly in those months. Footsteps muffled on stone, voices low even when joyful. The Queen, now in her early 50s, did not dress in black. She wore deep green, the color of life after rain, and kept a small ring on her hand, his azee, resized to fit her narrow finger. She did not hide her sorrow, nor did she speak of it often, but all who served her knew that something had shifted, not broken, not faded, but deepened. She was still England's queen, still sharp in counsel, and still regal in speech, still unbent before the thrones of Europe. But now she ruled not as half of a pair, nor as the solitary virgin of myth, but as the last steward of a chapter she knew was coming to its final line, because her son was ready. Henry, now 23 years old, stood tall in court. His face, a balance between the narrow-browed intensity of his mother and the open confidence of his father. He spoke rarely, but when he did, men listened. He bore the weight of expectation not with arrogance, but with steady grace. The people adored him. The court feared him. A little. And Elizabeth, she watched him like one watches a rising tide, knowing it is natural, inevitable, and beautiful in its power. By the year 1587, she had begun to step back, not as abdication, but as preparation. She still signed royal orders, still addressed Parliament, but increasingly, it was Henry who hosted foreign envoys, Henry who reviewed naval expansion, Henry who walked among the people in times of plague and harvest alike, and the people whispered his name, not as a hope, but as a certainty. He would be king, not someday, soon. And yet, Elizabeth did not fear that passing on. She had prepared her kingdom for this moment, as one prepares a garden for spring, tending the soil, cutting back the overgrowth, planting seeds that would bear fruit long after her own shadow had faded from the palace halls. She had endured scandal, war, betrayal, and loss. She had married for love, and ruled through storms. And now, with Robert gone and Henry grown, she turned inward, not in retreat, but in reflection. She spent long hours in her private chambers, reading not policy, but poetry. She walked the gardens alone. She wrote letters to old friends, to Henry, even to herself. Sometimes, late at night, she would rise from bed and walk through the painted galleries by candlelight, stopping before portraits that now seemed to speak in whispers. Anne Boleyn, eyes fierce with warning. Henry VIII, hand resting on the hilt of imagined triumph. A younger Elizabeth, painted in her wedding gown, forever frozen in that moment of radiant defiance. And then she would move on, because the past, she knew, was not meant to be lived in, only remembered. Her final years were not marked by decline, but by softness. She allowed herself small joys, chess with Henry, music at sunset, letters from children she had once cradled in her arms as infants and who now served as envoys, captains, poots. She allowed herself to laugh again, to weep when needed, to be seen not only as queen but as woman, as mother, as widow. And then, one spring morning in the year 1599, she did not wake. There had been no illness, no sudden pain, only a long, slow weakening. Like light withdrawing from a room, her ladies found her still in bed, her hand resting atop a folded piece of parchment. On it, a single sentence, written in her own hand: "Let him be crowned in peace." And so he was. The coronation of Henry IX was unlike any England had seen. There was no crisis, no factional war, no uncertain air raised by foreign hands. There was only certainty. The streets of London overflowed. Bells rang for hours. The crown, once so heavy in history, rested easily upon his brow. He did not weep. He did not boast. He only bowed his head when his mother's name was spoken and kept her ring on a chain beneath his collar. And what of the world she left behind? It was changed. The great powers of Europe no longer saw England as a vulnerable island queen's realm. They saw a dynasty, A Protestant house forged not from rejection but from unity. A monarchy that had survived plots, defied expectations, and produced a son strong enough to command before ever holding the scepter. The arts, too, bore her imprint. Shakespeare, now nearing the end of his career, penned one last history play, Queen and Consort. A fictionalized telling of a monarch who had chosen love over fear and built an empire with it. It was not entirely accurate. No history ever is. But it was beautiful, and in the final act, when the Queen walks alone into the mist, her son watching from the gates, the audience rose in silence, not for the play, but for the memory, and the people remembered, not just the Queen who had ruled, not just the prince who had risen, but the woman who had dared to choose happiness, the woman who had made that happiness a matter of state, the woman who had rewritten what it meant to wear a crown. She had not been Gloriana, distant and cold. She had been Elizabeth, daughter, queen, wife, mother, and the ghost of her love, the quiet, patient, enduring bond with the boy from the tower, lingered, not in rumor or regret, but in every law passed by her son, in every victory won under the Dudley crest, in every lullaby sung in homes where daughters were told they, too, might one day rule not by fear, but by choice. She had left the world more stable than she found it. She had left it more human, and that, more than any statue or epic, was her legacy.